Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, if you ever feel like the world is just collapsing under the weight of its own complexity, and you're looking for someone who spent a lifetime really mapping out the flaws, then this is for you. Today, we are focusing on the life and, the monumental systems thinking of Doug Carmichael.
And Carmichael, he's not just another voice, commenting on information overload. He's a true intellectual outlier.
How so? What makes him so different?
Well, what's unique is that his radical personal discipline, how he manages himself, how he insists others communicate, that's the direct blueprint for his macro vision for restructuring society.
But the micro is the macro for him.
Exactly. And he's operating with this incredible focus. He's 85, but he describes himself as someone who just do not feel it at all. And right now, he is singularly focused on his legacy and making sure it addresses the crises we're all facing.
That connection from the hyperpersonal to the hypersystemic is just... it's startling.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is to explore how Carmichael's deep, almost uncompromising beliefs about individual accountability and, genuine human collaboration. How that all informs his demands for these extreme systemic changes he thinks are necessary. And we're pulling directly from his own candid reflections, from his participation in a bunch of community calls where he's really laid this all out.
And what's so fascinating is how seamlessly his work bridges those two worlds, the micro and the macro. On one hand, he's dictating exactly how we should listen to one another in a meeting. And on the other, he's forecasting how entire political and economic systems inevitably accelerate their own failure. He sees his whole life, his whole career, as a commitment to what he calls a learning journey.
A learning journey.
Yes, and that journey is the critical filter for how he sees the world's problems. It's practical, but it's rooted in a really profound and sometimes painful personal philosophy. I think to really grasp the gravity of his critiques, his radical ideas, we have to start there. With his personal foundation, Carmichael talks about this point in his life as a personal transitional moment, a moment of legacy.
Yeah.
And the window into that, strangely enough, is his intense practice of gratitude.
It's not just, a pleasant check-in. His gratitude list is like an intellectual inventory. It's an inventory of the values and conditions that let him keep up this incredibly demanding work ethic.
So what's on the list?
Well, he expressed profound thanks, first, for just having been able to live a good life amidst many good people around me. Then he also acknowledges the privilege of having wonderful conversations with remarkable people leading to exciting ideas.
That part, the exciting ideas that focus on the intellectual environment, is so key, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
It shows that for him, collaboration and even a bit of intellectual friction, that's the fuel for his engine.
And crucially, he also includes the political and social stability he's benefited from. He acknowledges the, relative peace of the last 75 years, which gave him the stable backdrop to do all this deep exploration.
So he's aware of the context.
Deeply aware. He mentions living in places that are comforting and challenging and inspiring and also relatively at peace. And that's not an accident. He knows that his ability to even think about and design these radical restructurings comes from a place of intense personal stability.
And, relative privilege.
Exactly. It's that dual awareness. On one hand, deep gratitude for his good fortune, but on the other, this uncompromising recognition of the huge structural problems the world faces. That paradox is what keeps him driving forward at 85.
He's leveraging his stability against the system's instability.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
And if we connect this to his bigger personal journey, it gives so much context for his later ideas on choice and agency. He's startlingly open about his past, even mentioning his own bouts with suicide in his early years.
That candor is. It's necessary to understand the intensity of his commitment to growth. He talks about how fortunate he feels to have, in his words, stepped onto that learning journey.
It wasn't passive.
Not at all. It was a conscious, chosen path. It required overcoming huge personal hurdles, and that experience just cemented his fundamental belief that any progress, whether it's personal or systemic, it requires deliberate, hard intention.
And that intentionality, that brings us to the core philosophy he got from M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled. This is absolutely central to how he sees everything.
It's the linchpin. And it's so important we get the quote right because the subtlety is usually lost.
Right. People always misquote it.
They do. The common misquote sounds like fate. Many are called, few were chosen. But the quote he emphasizes, which is so much more demanding, is many are called, few choose.
few choose. The distinction is everything.
It's everything because it shifts all the responsibility right back onto the individual.
So the action is the choice itself.
Precisely. It underscores his belief that learning, growth, the hard work of systems change. It's not handed to you. You're not pre-selected. You have to actively, difficultly choose to step onto that path.
So when he critiques a failing system, he's also holding the individual accountable for their choice not to engage or not to learn.
Exactly. So whether you're talking about fixing a global crisis or just achieving your own personal well-being, the prerequisite is always that intentional choice, that radical agency.
The constant choice to be present.
And to learn. And this agency, he insists, has to be grounded in immediate biological reality. He has this powerful morning ritual from his meditation practice.
Right, where he celebrates the miracle of being alive.
Yes, after his body has been reset during sleep. And he used a very striking phrase for it.
He did.
He says, "Holy fuck, it still works."
Huh, I love that.
But think about that. That level of just primal appreciation for biological function, the sheer mechanics of his 85-year-old body, his hands being able to walk, processing complex thought.
It's intense. We completely overlook that, the miracle of our own physical machinery.
We do. And for Carmichael, celebrating that complex biological machine, that's the foundation.
Yeah.
He has to manage his own machine before he can even try to map and manage the world's problems. That personal management is a revolutionary act.
And that really clarifies the paradox of his age and his intense commitment to work. He's 85, yet he says he's comfortable working harder than ever.
Yeah, that challenges every cultural expectation we have about aging.
Completely.
He describes himself as someone who just do not feel it at all, suggesting his mind and his energy are just fully in sync with his purpose. This high sense of agency, it seems to be the core engine for him. It's a testament to the power of that continuous learning journey.
So for him, this moment of legacy isn't a time to scale back.
It's a license to intensify, because the problems are intensifying even faster. He's comfortable knowing that, understanding things perfectly might not even be the highest goal. Sometimes just choosing to keep going, to contribute, to map the complexity, that's the ultimate act of resistance against decay.
Okay, so that strong personal discipline, that willingness to choose the hard path, that whole holy fick it still works mentality, that's something he immediately transfers and even demands when he engages with other people.
Oh, absolutely, especially when collaborating on serious issues.
And this brings us to his, strong, almost radical views on how people should listen and how meetings should be structured.
They're non-negotiable for him, because for Carmichael, bad communication is the very first way a system starts to fail. If you can't even fully listen to the person next to you, how on earth can you coordinate some multi-billion-dollar global restructuring?
It starts small.
It has to, and he holds this firm belief that true presence and deep listening are completely mutually exclusive with distraction.
So let's talk about that. His immediate practical stance on multitasking. In this age of Zoom, chat, secondary screens, he's just crystal clear. You can't listen deeply and chat at the same time.
It's a cognitive fact for him. He sees reading the chat while someone is speaking as a disruption that actively prevents good listening.
Because you're splitting your focus.
Pulling cognitive focus from the auditory input and putting it on a second asynchronous stream of information. You're trying to process language through two different senses at the same time. The best you can get is this shallow multifocusing mode.
And he sees that as a fundamental betrayal of the act of communication.
A betrayal, absolutely. He admits to sometimes using the chat himself, but strictly as a little reminder zone, for personal notes, not for real-time engagement with what others are saying.
So the rule is simple. The verbal conversation can't be derailed by the text stream.
Because it just fragments attention. It prevents the group from achieving that shared deep state of presence.
And that kind of communication failure, according to his systems thinking, that translates directly into flawed policy.
It does. It has to. And that focus leads right into the highly structured collaboration method he favors for serious issues, the serious conversations format.
Yeah, what's that?
It's a method that's meticulously designed to ensure presence, reflection, and equitable contribution from everyone.
Okay, that sounds like a huge departure from the usual messy, open-floor meeting. How does it work? Especially that equitable contribution part that's often the first thing to fail.
The structure is simple, but the psychological contract is demanding. Participants are invited one by one to state what's been on their mind that is most worthy of a serious conversation.
Okay.
The contributions have to be short, focused, concise, and just reflecting their deepest current thinking on the matter.
And what's the core rule?
The core rule, and this is crucial, is that the goal is only to stimulate others, not to convince.
It's to stimulate.
Right. And once a speaker feels that they've achieved that stimulation, they have to stop talking.
Whoa, okay, wait. Let me challenge that for a second. Stopping when you've stimulated. That runs completely counter to how high-stakes discussions usually work. The goal is to keep talking until you've won the argument.
I know.
So how do you prevent a system based on stimulation from just collapsing into awkward silence or passive aggression, especially when you're dealing with really polarizing issues?
It's a great question, and the answer is in the psychological safety that's built into the structure. By requiring everyone to say their most wordy thought early on, and by stating this low barrier for success just stimulates someone, it lowers the group's anxiety. It ensures everyone is heard, or as he puts it, hearing their own voice in the group. That's a prerequisite for genuine participation. It's an intentional effort to maximize the breadth of ideas before the real discussion begins. It stops the group from getting stuck on the first or the loudest person.
So it prioritizes data gathering and reflection over immediate consensus or, victory.
Yes. The serious conversations mechanism is designed to manage the human ego, that tendency toward dominance. It forces people into a posture of intellectual contribution, not combat. It's a microsystem designed for integrity.
And that microsystem of integrity, that's the perfect philosophical tissue to move to his critique of macro failures.
Exactly. The failure of one person to listen deeply is the exact mirror of the failure of an institution to hold itself accountable.
That's the perfect transition. This shift from personal discipline and clean communication to these huge macro-systemic issues is seamless for Carmichael. The same lack of focus he sees in a Zoom chat is, on a massive scale, why he thinks governance is failing.
And he sees this accountability failure not as, some modern political problem. He sees it as a deep crisis that spans decades, even centuries. It's rooted in human dishonesty and delegation failure.
And the symptoms are everywhere.
Everywhere, from the interpersonal to the institutional. And he connects them directly to institutional integrity.
Can you give us an example? How does this historical lack of accountability show up today? Say, in a high-stakes area like scientific research.
He points to the pervasive issue in research and academia, where the heads of labs will routinely sign their names to work done by dozens of different postdocs and technicians.
Right.
And while, sure, administrative oversight is necessary, this practice creates a massive ethical gap. The person taking the credit, the figurehead, is often not the person who actually ran the experiments or analyzed the data or wrote the first draft.
It severs that essential link between effort, ownership, and integrity.
Completely. And the consequence, which we are living through right now, is the modern crisis and failure to replicate findings in science. If the true originators aren't held accountable, or if they're incentivized to fudge data to get published under a powerful name, integrity just dissolves.
And sometimes this dysfunction is intentionally built into programs, right? Like a self-destruct mechanism, the poison pill policy.
He argues that in cynical times, some policies are designed structurally to ensure they self-destruct. So dysfunction was the end result. He used the example of the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC.
Okay, how did the EITC function as a poison pill?
Well, the mechanism was complex and frustrating by design. On one hand, one political side wanted a way to give financial relief to the working poor, which is a positive goal.
Sure.
But on the other, they didn't want a simple, clean program like a universal basic income. The compromise was a structure that was incredibly complex to administer and to claim.
So it was hard for the people who needed it most to actually use it.
Exactly. It required specific income thresholds, all this documentation, these phase-outs. It made compliance a nightmare for the very people it was supposed to help. It forced them into expensive tax prep services or they'd risk an audit. Carmichael's point is that one side wanted the program to exist on paper, while the other side wanted it not to work in practice.
And both sides got what they wanted.
Both got their way, leading to a dysfunctional outcome that satisfied cynical political goals but completely failed the public through bureaucratic complexity.
That is a profound illustration of integrity failure. And this is where it gets really interesting when we shift to modern lawmaking. Carmichael is extremely frustrated with legislative dysfunction, and he links it directly to a lack of basic due diligence, a lack of reading.
This is a failure of democratic governance at the most fundamental level. He describes the mean strategy used in capitals all over the world. This systematic practice of putting forward 2,000-page bills voted on in the middle of the night,
Yeah.
it is physically and cognitively impossible for legislators, even if they were trying their hardest, to read and fully grasp what they're passing. And the consequence is simple. Members of Congress are not reading bills before they vote. It breaks the representative contract.
They're just voting on titles and summaries.
Not the content. But with the rise of new technology, generative AI, isn't there a potential solution here? Or is the problem deeper?
That's a good question. What's his take on that?
He acknowledges the technical possibility. AI could help. It could act like a sophisticated craftsperson, flagging inconsistencies, identifying contradictions, cross-referencing new text with existing law.
Things that used to require expert human law writers.
Right. But he insists the underlying issue is the lack of a basic requirement for legislators to read and understand what they pass.
So technology can check the logic, but it can't enforce the ethics.
Exactly. Technology can give you the tool for better governance, but it can't substitute for the ethical, accountable decision to understand what you're voting on. It's a systemic failure of human integrity, a willful ignorance that just perpetuates the collapse cycle.
Okay, now we move to the macro view, and this is where Carmichael's thinking gets truly radical. It demands that we just abandon our comfortable narratives. He argues the current system is so profoundly flawed that only extreme change can work, and he grounds this in these alternative historical narratives.
What's fascinating is his deep engagement with thinkers who challenge that traditional, sanitized story of civilization. People like James Scott, the anthropologist. Right.
Carmichael highlights Scott's work on early state formation, which challenges the whole notion that civilization was inherently a good or liberating thing.
And that completely flips the script on what something like a city wall meant.
It does. Scott argues, and Carmichael emphasizes, that the walls around early cities were often built not to keep barbarians out, the nomadic, freer people, but specifically to keep the people in.
As subjects, taxpayers, slaves.
Exactly. Civilization was, in this reading, an apparatus of control. It required forced labor and taxation just to maintain itself.
That is a very dark lens to view modern systems through. And it ties directly to his observations on the origin and scale of slavery.
He links this to a dark historical scale, noting that for a long, long time, maybe 2/3 of the world's population might have been enslaved. And it raises this provocative rhetorical question he asks today. Are we really still living in slavery?
Wow.
He uses this to critique modern life, a small apartment, the limited food supplies that we have. He's suggesting that domestication in modern systems haven't necessarily made us free or healthy. And he has that analogy about brain size.
Yeah, he cites evidence that the brain size of domesticated animals is smaller than their wild counterparts. And he suggests we have to grapple with the possibility that modern human domestication has had similar effects on our own health and agency.
So if the current system is just a more complex form of historical control, how does that history inform his view of how modern collapse happens?
This is where his theory of elite acceleration comes in. When complex systems start failing due to climate stress, inequality, political decay, the elites who own the infrastructure, they stop doing what's required to sustain the system. Crucially, they stop investing in rebuilding or reinventing it.
So instead of patching the faults, they monetize them.
Exactly. They actively take costs out in order to take more money out for themselves as it moves towards collapse.
And how do they do that? Take costs out.
They defer maintenance on essential things like energy grids and transit systems. They lay off necessary regulators. They leverage debt against future revenue streams they know will never materialize. They sell off communal assets for short-term cash.
It's a fire sale.
It is. And this acceleration of self-serving resource extraction directly hastens the collapse. They're optimizing for personal profit in the short window before the system fully fails, rather than ensuring its resilience.
So it's a failure of moral and structural integrity that accelerates the cascade of faults. The decision makers have disconnected their personal fate from the system's fate.
Precisely. And this ties directly into his critique of modern political solutions. He appreciated Bernie Sanders' critique that the system is fundamentally broken.
But not the solutions.
He was deeply disappointed in the proposed solutions. He said they sounded like 1960s socialist politics. Carmichael believes the scale of the crisis requires a framework that is completely divorced from 20th century political debates.
It's interesting, though, that he acknowledges the very economic framework that created this mess also had benefits. He says the neoclassical economics approach did yield substantial benefits over the last 50 years.
He's very pragmatic about history. He cites the measurable global achievements, massive poverty reduction, huge health gains, dramatically increased literacy rates worldwide.
So he's saying those systems worked for a time.
They worked incredibly well to create unprecedented material abundance, but now they're failing, and in their failure, they are creating immense waste and pain.
Why is that distinction so important to him? Why not just condemn the whole system?
Because for Carmichael, this failure isn't just a disaster, it's a necessary precursor. It's a lever. He argues that both the abundance that has been created and the waste and pain, they're both useful for what he calls the second emergence.
How are they useful?
The abundance gives us the technological tools and the available resource base. The waste and pain provide the necessary leverage, the acute crisis that forces radical change. You can't imagine a new world until the old world's failure becomes completely inescapable.
Okay, so this brings us to his 4 categories. His 4 pillars of change that he believes are essential for surviving this systemic failure. And these changes have to be big enough to make a difference.
Right, because most of the current proposals are dangerously insufficient. So the first category is foundational. It strikes at the heart of our imagination, a believable image of the future. He argues we are trapped inside narratives that limit our imagination to just minor adjustments.
And what's his solution to that?
Carmichael insists we must invent the world that's uncomfortable for people like us.
Uncomfortable? Why does it need to be uncomfortable if it's supposed to be a better future?
Because a resilient future cannot look like a slightly greener, slightly fairer version of the status quo. It has to be structurally alien to our current system of high consumption, speed, and centralization. If the future feels too comfortable, it means you haven't really changed anything fundamental.
So it needs to be imagined at the edge of a believable image.
Exactly. Not dystopian sci-fi, but a functional reality that requires profound personal and cultural change, including where and how we live.
Okay. The second category addresses the sheer logistical challenge of that change. A management task beyond scale.
Yeah.
If we're serious about this, he estimates that a very large part of the world's population has to change how they make a living and where they live.
It's staggering to think about this level of disruption management. Managing the migration, reskilling, relocation of billions of people is beyond anything we have ever tried.
Right.
We have no contemporary peacetime management system that's capable of that.
But isn't there a real ethical tension there? How does he square the demand for deep individual agency with the necessity of such massive centralized management? I mean, moving and reskilling a huge chunk of the global population.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound potentially authoritarian?
That is the essential friction point in his framework, and he acknowledges that the scale demands a level of coordination we usually only see in wartime. The only historical hint we have are these extreme examples of rapid industrial reorganization, like when General Motors switched from making cars to tanks and planes in 90 days during World War II.
So we need to study those laws of rapid, large-scale reorganization.
Yes, he's not advocating for authoritarianism. He's pointing out that the managerial scale required for survival is like a managed emergency.
So the shift has to be intentional and managed. Otherwise, the cascade of faults, the collapses, will manage the population for us through chaos and starvation.
That's his point. He believes the transition must be managed ethically, but with a speed and decisiveness that currently only exists in wartime mobilization. The failure to manage change leads to a much more authoritarian outcome: systemic collapse.
Okay. The third category addresses the economic mechanism that accelerates that collapse: social ownership models. We have the green tech, but he says it won't work if it just perpetuates the existing power structures.
We have to implement new models of social ownership that are not boring to leverage those technologies. If the existing mechanisms that concentrate wealth stay in place, they will just continually limit the benefits.
Why not boring? What does he mean by that?
Because the old 20th century models, nationalization, Soviet-style communism, they were boring, they were rigid, and they were ultimately ineffective at fostering innovation and local agency.
So what would a not boring model look like?
It has to be dynamic, networked. It has to focus on the decentralized sharing of surplus, leveraging digital tech to enforce equity and accountability in a way previous models couldn't. They have to empower local decision-making while still maintaining scale, creating these resilient, decentralized economic commons that prevent wealth from flowing up to the accelerating elites.
A completely new economic mechanism.
One that's intrinsically equitable and focused on shared abundance, not extraction.
And finally, the fourth pillar, the cultural support system. education, and arts.
These domains, he argues, must be explicitly directed to support the other three categories. They provide the narrative infrastructure, the cultural consensus, the emotional resilience you need for this new reality.
So art and education are essential for inventing the world that's uncomfortable for people like us.
Exactly. Art is essential for waking people up, for changing the collective narrative, and for building consensus around an uncomfortable future without just collapsing into despair.
Before we wrap up his macro view, we have to discuss what he feels is the most crucial missing piece in all of our current societal planning.
Yes. And it ties directly back to his critique of what our current economic ledger actually values.
Which is?
The complete exclusion of the caring economy. This is a vast, undervalued domain. It encompasses child-rearing, caring for the elderly, general well-being, and critically resource husbandry.
Okay, let's define resource husbandry. What does he mean by that, and why is its exclusion so harmful?
Resource husbandry is the proper management, the maintenance, and the respectful use of our natural resources: soil health, water systems, forest vitality. When this is off the ledger, the economic system treats resources as infinite inputs whose depletion isn't counted as a cost.
Right.
So a corporation can extract topsoil rapidly to maximize crop yield, and on the economic ledger, that's a profit. But the long-term depletion of the resource, the lack of husbandry, that's an invisible cost that eventually leads to systemic failure, like dust bowls, desertification.
So Carmichael's point is this entire domain, the very fabric of human and ecological resilience, it's off the ledger.
Completely excluded. And if we don't value what truly sustains life, any system we build will remain fundamentally flawed and inherently destructive.
It's a deeply complex, challenging, and intensely demanding vision. It requires personal transformation before it demands societal transformation. It links that biological miracle of self-management to the mobilization of billions.
And that's the core of Carmichael's message. True societal progress requires deep individual honesty, starting with accountability and how we listen, paired with a pragmatic recognition that the necessary systemic redesign will be profoundly disruptive, historically demanding, and it must be intentional.
We have to be the grown-ups in the room.
We have to choose the path of growth.
And we have to look beyond these short-term fixes and comfortable narratives. We have to design a future that might feel alien, even uncomfortable for people like us, but one that's ultimately resilient.
It requires finding the leverage point that exists outside of politics as usual. And that leverage point, he notes, is often technical, but it has to be enforced by a cultural acceptance of accountability.
Which is why he found hope in places where trust is maintained locally.
Exactly.
And that brings us to our final thought for you, the learner. Carmichael found hope in local, trustworthy, collaborative mechanisms he calls mycelial networks. These are decentralized, peer-to-peer relationships focused on knowledge sharing and local resource maintenance, resisting that collapse of accountability from the top. So if accountability and integrity are failing in centralized governance, how can you cultivate robust collaboration and knowledge sharing within your own local commons, be it in your community, your industry, your peer group, to prepare for the inevitable cascade of faults, he predicts?
It's the small, deep human connections based on trust that might just outsmart the acceleration toward collapse.
Choose to step onto that learning journey today, recognizing that personal integrity is the foundation of systemic resilience. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the systems thinking of Doug Carmichael.